The moment Emma Langley stepped off the train at Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1882, she walked straight into the arms of a stranger who smelled of cheap whiskey and cheaper cologne, and everything she had carefully planned for the last 6 months of her life unraveled in a single, breathless instant. The train had been swaying and groaning for 3 days out of Philadelphia, carrying her west with a single leather trunk, a small beaded purse, and a folded letter she had read so many times that the creases had gone soft and the ink had begun to blur at the edges. The letter was from a man named Gerald Whitmore, a cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer, seeking a respectable woman of good character and sound constitution to come west and be his wife. Emma had answered that advertisement on a gray December morning while sitting alone in the parlor of her late father's house, listening to the solicitor in the next room read the terms of her father's will to her stepbrother, who had been left everything. She had answered it not out of romance or desperate foolishness, but out of a very practical, very clear-eyed need to survive. Gerald Whitmore had written back promptly. His letters were brief and businesslike, which she had taken as a sign of good character. He told her he ran 5,000 acres outside of Caldwell, that he had a proper house with glass windows, and that he expected a woman who could manage a household and did not complain unnecessarily. He was 42 years old. She was 26. He had enclosed a train ticket, second class, and told her he would be waiting at the platform on July the 14th. It was July the 14th. The man who caught her as she stumbled down the last iron step of the passenger car was not Gerald Whitmore. She knew this because Gerald Whitmore had described himself in his last letter as tall, lean, and silver-haired. The man who had grabbed her by both arms and was now beaming down at her with a red, fleshy face and a mustache that had clearly seen better days was none of these things. He was wide through the middle, short through the leg, and his eyes had the particular watery cheerfulness of a man who had been drinking since mid-morning. "Miss Langley," he said, with a great deal of enthusiasm that she did not feel was entirely warranted by their acquaintance, which was, as far as she was concerned, precisely 0 seconds old. "I knew you right away. Gerald said you were a beauty, and Lord above, he was not wrong." Emma opened her mouth and then closed it, because she had been raised to be polite in difficult circumstances, and this qualified as a difficult circumstance. The platform around her was chaotic, full of arriving passengers and men with horses and a boy selling newspapers, and somewhere behind her the train was hissing and groaning as though it too had opinions about the situation. "I am afraid you have me at a disadvantage," she said carefully. "You know my name, but I do not believe we have been introduced." The man laughed, which seemed to be his answer to most things. "Beg your pardon, Miss Langley, I am Howard Creel. Gerald Whitmore is my employer and my very dear friend, and he asked me to come collect you on his behalf, seeing as how he had business to attend to this morning that could not be postponed." Something cold settled in Emma's stomach, but she kept her face pleasant, because what else could she do? She was 26 years old, she had $3.40 in her purse, she was standing on a train platform in a town she had never seen before in her life, and the man she had come west to marry had not even thought fit to collect her himself. She had no address to go to, no knowledge of the town, and absolutely no plan beyond Gerald Whitmore. "I see," she said. Howard Creel grabbed her trunk before she could reach for it herself, tucking it under one beefy arm with surprising ease, and took her by the elbow with the other hand, already steering her toward the far end of the platform where a wagon was hitched. It was at that precise moment, 2 feet behind her, that she heard a voice. "Mr. Creel." The voice was low and even, and it carried the particular quality of a man who did not need to raise it to be heard. Howard Creel stopped walking. Emma noticed that he stopped walking quite quickly, which told her something about the voice, and when she turned her head to look, she saw why. The man standing 2 feet behind her on the platform was not especially remarkable at first glance, and yet Emma found that she could not quite move her gaze away from him. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, and wearing a plain brown work shirt and dark trousers with boots that had seen a great deal of use. He had a hat pulled down low against the midday sun, and below the brim of it was a face that was angular and tanned and carrying an expression that was entirely unreadable. He was perhaps 30 or 31, she thought. There was a badge pinned to his shirt. It was a marshal's badge. "Patrick Ashford," Howard Creel said, and the cheerfulness in his voice had dropped about 20 degrees. "I see you are taking on new responsibilities," Patrick Ashford said, and his eyes moved from Howard Creel to Emma and then back again. "Who is the lady?" "She is none of your concern," Howard said. "I was not asking you," Patrick said, and he looked at Emma directly, and the quality of that look was the most straightforward thing she had experienced since stepping off the train. It was not forward or presumptuous, it was simply honest. "Are you all right, ma'am? You look uncertain." Emma considered in the space of a heartbeat how to answer that. She was uncertain. She was extremely uncertain. She had just been collected from a train platform by a man she did not know, who smelled of alcohol, on behalf of a man she had never met, in a town she had no familiarity with, and the only person who had thought to ask if she was all right was a stranger with a lawman's badge standing 2 feet behind her. "I am all right," she said, "but I would be more so if I knew where I was being taken." "She is going out to the Whitmore Ranch," Howard said, with a note of irritation creeping into his voice. "It is perfectly proper. Gerald is expecting her." Patrick Ashford did not move for a moment. His eyes were on Emma's face, and she had the uncomfortable and oddly comforting sensation that he was reading something there, something she had not consciously expressed. "Ma'am," he said, "are you acquainted with Mr. Whitmore?" "We have corresponded," she said. "Corresponded," he repeated, and something shifted very slightly in his expression. "I see. Are you here of your own free will?" "Patrick Ashford, I will not stand here and be insulted," Howard Creel began. "Howard," Patrick said, and his voice had not changed in volume at all, but Howard fell silent. "I am talking to the lady." "Yes," Emma said. "I am here of my own free will. I am Emma Langley from Philadelphia, and I have come to Caldwell to meet Mr. Gerald Whitmore." She paused, "though I will admit I was somewhat surprised not to find him here himself." Patrick Ashford looked at her for another moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Patrick Ashford, ma'am, town marshal. You will find me at the marshal's office on Main Street if you have any need. Welcome to Caldwell." He stepped back and walked away up the platform, and Emma watched him go for precisely 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary before she turned back to Howard Creel, who was looking at her with an expression she could not read. "He always makes a fuss," Howard said dismissively, and steered her toward the wagon. The Whitmore Ranch was 18 miles outside of Caldwell, and the ride took the better part of 2 hours in the heat. The landscape rolled out around her in every direction, flat and golden and enormous, the sky above it a hard bright blue that was nothing like the softer sky above Philadelphia. Emma sat on the wagon seat beside Howard Creel, who talked the entire way about cattle prices and the weather and a dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers that she had no context for, and she watched the grass move in long, slow waves in the wind and thought about the decision she had made 6 months ago in her father's parlor, and whether it was a good one. She had not, she was beginning to think, quite understood what she was getting into. Gerald Whitmore was on the porch when they arrived. He was exactly as advertised, in the physical sense. He was tall and lean, and his hair was silver, and he had the weathered, commanding look of a man who had spent his life outdoors telling other men what to do. He watched Emma climb down from the wagon with an expression that was appraising in a way that made her feel very much like one of his cattle being brought in for inspection. "Miss Langley," he said. He did not come down from the porch. "You made it." "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and she lifted her chin because she had not come 3 days across the country by train to be cowed on a porch step. "Thank you for the arrangement of my travel." He studied her for another moment. "You are thinner than I expected," he said. "I am exactly as I have always been," she said pleasantly, "and I trust I am exactly as described in my letters." Something crossed his face, something brief and assessing, and then he made a sound that was not quite approval but was not dissatisfaction either. "You will do," he said. He turned to Howard. "Put her in the east room," and he went back inside. Emma stood in the yard with dust on her boots and the afternoon sun on her shoulders, and thought very carefully about the fact that she had no money, no train ticket home, and nowhere else to go. She had come west to be a wife, and she was going to have to figure out whether this man was one she could actually live beside. The house was large by frontier standards, which is to say it was larger than a cabin but smaller than anything she had known in Philadelphia. There were 4 rooms and a kitchen and a back porch that looked out over a horse pasture. The east room had a bed and a chest of drawers and a window, and the window looked out over the yard where the hands moved about in the late afternoon doing their various duties. Emma unpacked her trunk slowly and methodically, shaking out her dresses and hanging them on the hooks behind the door, setting her hairbrush on the dresser top, placing her small Bible on the windowsill where the light could reach it. She was not without hope. She had come out here knowing that this was not going to be romantic. She had come out here because the alternative was to go to her stepbrother Daniel and ask him for a place to sleep in a house that had been her father's and was now his, and she had too much pride for that. She had come out here for a life of her own, and a life was made by the living of it, not by the wishing. But that evening at supper, Gerald Whitmore sat at the head of the table and ate in near silence while 2 of his ranch hands, including Howard Creel, occupied the other end. And Emma sat midway between them all and understood that she was not yet a guest and not yet a wife and something uncomfortably in between, and the food was good and plain and the silence was heavy. After supper, Gerald told her that the wedding would take place in 3 weeks when the circuit preacher came through. He told her this the way he might tell her about the timing of a cattle drive, and she said yes and thank you and went to her room. She did not sleep well. The next morning she woke before the sun and went out to the back porch and sat in the gray early light and listened to the prairie come awake around her. There were birds she did not know the names of. The grass was a pale silver in the pre-dawn, moving in great slow sighs. Somewhere a horse was moving in the pasture, its hooves soft in the dark. She had the sense, sitting there, that the land was very old and very indifferent, and that she was very small within it, and that this was not entirely a bad thing. Over the following days she learned the shape of the ranch and the shape of the man she was expected to marry. Gerald Whitmore was not cruel. She would not say he was cruel. He was remote and practical and thoroughly uninterested in her as a person while being quite interested in her as a function. He expected breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, and supper at 7. He expected the house to be kept in the manner he preferred, which she learned by trial and error. He expected her to manage the egg money and the household accounts. He expected, she gathered, very little else. She learned to ride, because the nearest town was 18 miles away, and she needed to know how to get there herself. One of the younger hands, a boy named Tommy who was 19 and had a gap between his front teeth and a cheerful disposition, taught her, patiently and without condescension, and within a week she could manage a horse well enough to make the journey to Caldwell without disgracing herself. She rode into town on a Thursday, 2 weeks after her arrival, to buy supplies from the general store. Caldwell in the summer of 1882 was a cattle town, which meant it was loud and dusty, and full of men with money in their pockets and few places to spend it wisely. The Long Branch Saloon was doing brisk business at 11 in the morning when she rode down Main Street, and she could hear laughter and a piano from behind the swinging doors as she tied her horse at the post outside the general store. She was coming out with her purchases when she nearly walked directly into Patrick Ashford. He stepped back immediately, catching the door before it hit her, and she looked up and found that same direct, unhurried gaze she remembered from the platform. "Miss Langley," he said, and there was a note of what might have been genuine pleasure in his voice that surprised her. "Marshal Ashford," she said. "How are you settling in?" he asked. It was a perfectly ordinary question, and she was on the verge of giving it a perfectly ordinary answer when something in the evenness of his expression stopped her. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he had given her on the platform, the kind that did not ask for performance. "I am managing," she said, which was more honest than she had intended. "That is a careful answer," he said. "It is an accurate one," she replied. He was quiet for a moment, and the street moved around them, a man on a horse passing, a woman with a parasol crossing the opposite side, the continuous sound of the town going about its business. "Are you in need of anything?" he asked. "If there is anything the town can offer by way of assistance, it would be my business to see to it." She understood what he was asking beneath the formal language, and she was both moved by it and slightly embarrassed by the fact that she was moved by it. She was not in need of rescuing. She was doing this herself. "That is very kind," she said, "but I am quite all right." He nodded. He stepped aside to let her pass. She walked to her horse and began untying the reins, and she was aware, without looking, that he was still standing by the general store door watching her, not in an intrusive way, but in the way of a man who is making sure that something fragile makes it safely away from the edge. "Miss Langley," he said, just as she had her foot in the stirrup. She paused and looked back. "The Caldwell Ladies' Sewing Circle meets Friday afternoons at 2 o'clock, he said. "Mrs. Clara Heston runs it, and she is a good woman. It might be worth knowing." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it more than the two words conveyed. She thought about him the whole ride back. She did not go to the sewing circle on Friday, because Gerald had decided that the accounts needed organizing, and he wanted her to do it that afternoon, and she was not yet in a position to argue about priorities. But she went the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and Clara Heston turned out to be exactly what Patrick Ashford had suggested, a broad, warm woman of 40 with sharp eyes and a broad lap, and a way of listening that made people tell her things they had not intended to say. Within 3 Fridays, Emma had told Clara everything. About Philadelphia and her father's death, and Daniel inheriting the house, and the advertisement and Gerald Whitmore and the silence at supper, and the 3 weeks that were counting down to the circuit preacher, and the wedding that felt less and less like a wedding and more like a formal arrangement. "He is not a bad man," Emma said, working her needle through the fabric with more force than strictly necessary. "He is honest, and he does not drink, and the ranch is prosperous." "I knew I was not coming out here for romance." "There is a large space between romance and being told you will do on a porch step," Clara said serenely. Emma laughed, which surprised her. She had not laughed much since arriving in Caldwell. "What would you do?" she asked. Clara was quiet for a moment, threading her needle with the precision of long practice. "I would think very carefully," she said, "about whether the life you could build here is the life you can actually live, not whether it is a good life in the abstract, whether it is your life." Emma thought about this for a long time. She was thinking about it on the following Tuesday morning when she rode into Caldwell to pick up a letter she had been expecting from a school friend in Philadelphia, and she was still thinking about it when she came out of the post office and found Howard Creel leaning against the hitching post beside her horse, and the smell of whiskey was very strong in the heat. "Miss Langley," he said, and his tone was very different from the jovial one he had used on the platform. "We need to have a conversation." "I do not think we do," she said, reaching for her reins. He moved between her and the horse, not touching her but blocking her path with the bulk of him. "Gerald has been reconsidering the arrangement," he said. "He asked me to speak to you." She went very still. "He asked you," she said quietly, "to speak to me about our arrangement." "He is not certain you are suitable," Howard said, and she could hear that he was enjoying this in some small, mean way. He had expected a more biddable kind of woman, less opinionated. "I have given my opinions precisely once," she said, keeping her voice absolutely level, "about the timing of the household washing." "That is hardly opinionated." "Gerald is a man who likes things a particular way," Howard said. "He is thinking he may need to write off for someone more agreeable." The cruelty of it hit her all at once. not the possibility of Gerald's rejection, because she had been honest with herself about the fact that she was not in love with the man, but the precariousness, the fact that she was alone out here with no money and no ticket home, and she was being told, by this man with his whiskey breath and his mean satisfaction, that the one thing she had come out here for might be yanked away and she would be left with nothing. She was still holding her reins. She heard boots on the boardwalk. Howard, Patrick Ashford's voice completely even. Howard turned, and the expression on his face was the same one he had worn on the platform, the same involuntary alertness. "Miss Langley," Patrick said, not looking at Howard at all, "is everything all right?" "I believe so," she said carefully. Patrick looked at Howard. "You are blocking the lady's horse," he said. There was a pause that lasted several seconds and contained quite a lot of information, and then Howard Creel stepped aside. Emma mounted her horse with complete composure. She looked down at Patrick Ashford from the saddle, and she was aware that she was not going to say anything adequate to the moment, but she tried anyway. "Thank you," she said. "I will be at the general store for the next hour if you have need of anything," he said. She rode. She did not look back this time, because if she looked back she was going to cry, and she was not going to do that on Main Street in front of anyone. She cried on the prairie, alone, with the grass moving around her and the sky enormous above her, and the horse moving steadily beneath her. And she let herself have 10 minutes of it, and then she stopped, because she had been managing herself alone for a long time and she was not going to stop now. That evening Gerald Whitmore told her, over supper, with the same tone he used for cattle prices, that he had given the matter further consideration and had decided that the wedding would proceed as planned. He did not mention Howard or the conversation on Main Street. She did not mention it either. She said thank you and passed the biscuits and resolved to write a letter to Clara Heston in the morning and ask her what a woman needed to do in order to find employment as a schoolteacher in Caldwell, Kansas, because she was going to need options. The wedding was 12 days away. She rode into Caldwell the next morning with the express purpose of posting 2 letters, one to Clara about the school and one to her friend in Philadelphia, and she was tying her horse when she heard her name. It was Patrick Ashford coming down the boardwalk toward her, and she noticed, not for the first time, the way he moved, unhurried but direct, as though he always knew precisely where he was going and saw no reason to make a performance of it. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He fell into step beside her without invitation, which she did not mind in the way she would have minded it from most men, because it felt less like presumption and more like accompaniment. "I have been meaning to ask after you since yesterday." "I am all right," she said. "I believe you," he said. "You seem to be a woman who manages to be all right even in circumstances that are not." She glanced at him sideways. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Both, I think," he said, and she caught the edge of a smile, the first she had seen from him. They were walking past the harness shop when she said, without precisely intending to, "What do you know about Gerald Whitmore?" He was quiet for the length of 3 storefronts. "What would you like to know?" he asked. "The truth," she said. "The kind that does not get mentioned in letters." He was quiet for a moment longer. They stopped outside the post office, and he held the door and she went in first, and they stood in the small, dim space while the postmaster sorted something in the back, and Patrick Ashford took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "Gerald Whitmore is not a dishonest man," he said carefully. "He is not a violent one. He pays what he owes and he runs his land well and his hands stay on for years, which tells you something." He paused. "But he has been alone a long time, and he has organized his life around a certain set of expectations, and he treats the people around him the way he treats the functions on his ranch, effectively and without particular tenderness." She looked at him. He met her gaze. "You are telling me what I already know," she said. "I am confirming it," he said quietly, "because sometimes it helps to hear that what you know is real." She posted her letters and they walked back out into the morning sunshine, and he walked with her to her horse, and she had the specific and disorienting sensation of wanting very much to continue the conversation and not knowing how to justify doing so. "Can I ask you something?" she said, untying the reins. "Yes," he said. "Why do you keep turning up?" She said it gently, with curiosity rather than challenge. "At the platform, and then after that, and yesterday. I do not think it is coincidence." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression of a man weighing honesty against discretion and coming down on the side of honesty. "Caldwell is not a large town," he said, "and you are a stranger here and alone. And the first time I saw you, you had the look of a woman walking into something she had not been given all the information about." He paused. "That concerns me. It is my job to be concerned by such things." "And when it is not your job?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, the sun full on his face, the hat still in his hand. "Then I am just a man who did not like the look of how that morning was going," he said. She had no answer to that. She swung up into the saddle and turned the horse toward the south road. "Marshal Ashford," she said, looking down at him. "Patrick, thank you for all of it." "Emma," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the honorific, and it sat strangely in the air between them, like something placed carefully on a table rather than dropped. "You are welcome." She rode home through the golden mid-morning and thought about the sound of her name in that voice for most of the 18 miles. Over the following week, everything came to a head in the way that things do when several truths have been circling each other for long enough. It happened on a Wednesday. Howard Creel came to her in the afternoon while Gerald was out on the range, and he was drunk, properly drunk this time rather than merely well-started, and he told her that the reason Gerald was reconsidering her was that Howard had told him she had been seen in extended conversation with the marshal on 2 separate occasions, and that Gerald did not like it. Emma looked at him with such complete steadiness that he stopped speaking. "Mr. Creel," she said, "I am going to ask you to leave this house." "Gerald wants," he started. "Gerald can tell me himself what he wants," she said. "You will leave now." He left. She stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table until they stopped shaking, and then she went and saddled her horse herself, because Tommy was out with the others, and she rode to Caldwell. She was not going to talk to Patrick Ashford. She was not going to do that. She was going to talk to Clara Heston, because Clara was the person to talk to, and she was going to get a clear view of what her options were and make a rational decision. Clara was not home. The note on her door said she had gone to tend a sick neighbor 2 miles east. Emma stood on Clara's porch in the afternoon heat and breathed very carefully in and out, and then she walked down Main Street to the marshal's office, because she needed to talk to someone who dealt in clarity. He was at his desk when she pushed open the door, working through some papers, and he looked up and something moved across his face, something that was quickly composed. He stood up. "Emma," he said, "what has happened?" She sat down in the chair across from his desk and told him, calmly and precisely, about Howard Creel and the pattern of his behavior, and the drinking, and what he had said about Gerald, and the conversation she had had with Clara, and the letters she had posted, and she told him that she needed to understand what her actual position was if she walked away from the Whitmore Ranch before the wedding, because she had almost no money and she needed to know if there was any practical path forward. He listened to all of it without interrupting, leaning slightly forward with his forearms on the desk, and when she finished he did not give her false reassurance or tell her everything would be fine, which she appreciated. "The school," he said. "There is a teacher's position. The current schoolmistress is leaving in September to be married. The school board has been discussing replacements. Do you have training?" "I have a better education than most people in Philadelphia," she said evenly. The corner of his mouth moved. "I believe you," he said. "I sit on the school board. Clara Heston does as well. Between us, I think we could make a case." She looked at him. "That would require me to have somewhere to live," she said. "Mrs. Heston has a spare room," he said. "I know she has offered it to others. I cannot speak for her, but I believe she would offer it to you." She was quiet for a moment, organizing what she felt, relief partly, the particular clarity that comes from having a path, and underneath it something else, something that had been growing since the platform, since the general store, since every conversation in between. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Because I would like you to stay in Caldwell," he said, "and not because Gerald Whitmore brought you here." The room was very quiet. Outside, the town went about its business. A horse on the street, voices, the distant tinny sound of the saloon piano. "That is a direct answer," she said finally. "You asked a direct question," he said. She left the marshal's office and rode back to the Whitmore ranch as the sun was beginning to angle toward the west, and she had made her decision. She told Gerald at supper. She told him plainly, as one adult to another, that she did not believe the arrangement between them was well suited to make either of them happy, and that she thought the honest thing was to acknowledge it now rather than after the preacher had come and gone. She told him that she was grateful for the train ticket and she would repay it as soon as she was in a position to do so. Gerald Whitmore listened to all of this with his hands flat on the table and his face doing something complicated. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Howard told me something this morning," he said. "I imagine he did," she said. "About the marshal," he said. She met his gaze. "I have spoken to Patrick Ashford several times since I arrived," she said, and she did not look away. "He has been helpful and appropriate in every instance. If that is a problem, then I think it confirms that we are not well suited." Gerald was quiet for another long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh but was something in between. "I sent Howard to talk to you," he said, "the other week, on Main Street. I told him to explain things." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "He went further than I intended," Gerald said, which was the closest he was going to come to an apology, and she understood that. "I think you are a man who could make some woman a decent husband," she said, and she meant it. "I do not think that woman is me." He nodded once. He told her she could stay the night and he would have Tommy drive her into town in the morning, and she said thank you, and they finished supper in silence that was, for the first time, not uncomfortable. She stayed in the east room one last time, and she lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt, more than anything else, the particular lightness of a decision made and committed to. It was frightening, and it was also like breathing properly for the first time in weeks. Clara Heston received her the next morning with an exclamation of pleasure and immediate, practical hospitality. The spare room was offered and accepted within 5 minutes. Clara had already spoken to Patrick that morning. She told Emma without a great deal of pretense about how that had come to pass, and the school board would be meeting to discuss the teaching position at the end of the week. Emma unpacked her trunk into the spare room of Clara's comfortable house on Elm Street and felt, for the first time since she had left Philadelphia, as though she had her feet under her. She did not see Patrick for 2 days, which she spent learning the town properly, walking every street, introducing herself at the church and the school and the general store, letting Caldwell understand who she was. On the 3rd day she was at the well behind Clara's house in the early evening drawing up a bucket when she heard the gate and turned to find him coming through it, his hat in his hand. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. He came and took the bucket from her without ceremony and hung it on the hook and then stood there in the golden evening light with his hat in his hand and said nothing for a long moment. "How are you?" he asked finally. "I am better than I have been in some time," she said honestly. He nodded. He turned his hat over in his hands. For a man who was typically so composed, she thought, he seemed slightly less so this evening, which she found she liked very much. "The school board met," he said. "You are to meet with them Friday." "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "Your qualifications speak for themselves. I only made the introduction." She looked at him, the long amber evening light between them, the sound of the town settling toward night. "Patrick," she said, and he looked up. "I am going to stay in Caldwell, regardless of whether we become anything more than 2 people who have been honest with each other." She paused. "But I want you to know that whatever does or does not happen, these past weeks have mattered to me. The way you treated me from the beginning, it mattered." He was very still. "It mattered to me too," he said. "You matter to me." They stood there in the evening, 2 feet apart and not moving closer, because things that are real do not always need to move quickly, and because both of them had enough sense to let a thing breathe. She met with the school board on Friday morning. There were 4 of them, including Clara and Patrick, and a nervous man named Mr. Dobbs who asked her whether she was familiar with the McGuffey readers, which she was, and whether she had experience with children of varying ages, which she did, having tutored the neighbor children at home for 2 years. She was offered the position on the condition that she could begin in September, which was 6 weeks away, and she accepted it with composure and went out and stood on the boardwalk and breathed deeply and felt the specific joy of a person who has just claimed something for themselves. She celebrated by buying a slice of pie at the small eating establishment 2 doors down from the marshal's office, and she was sitting at the window table eating it when Patrick appeared in the doorway and looked at her with his hat in his hand and that almost smile. "Pie," she said, "to celebrate." "Congratulations," he said. He sat down across from her, without being asked, and without it feeling like a presumption, and she pushed the pie toward him, and he took a fork from the jar on the table, and they ate it together without much ceremony, and talked about the school and the students she would have, and the curriculum, and she found that talking to him was the easiest thing she had done in years. The weeks between the end of July and the beginning of September in 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, were not without event. There was a dispute between 2 cattle outfits over water rights that kept Patrick busy for the better part of a week. There was a fire in the dry goods store that Clara organized the women of the town to help with, packing supplies from their own pantries for the family who had lost their stock. Emma tutored the 3 youngest Dobbs children in reading through August to prepare herself, and she and Clara spent many evenings on the front porch in the cooling air, talking about everything and nothing, and Emma felt the shape of a real life assembling itself around her. She and Patrick fell into a pattern that was not yet courtship, but was clearly moving in that direction, in the unhurried and honest way of 2 people who have both been careful before. He walked with her to church on Sundays. They ate supper at Clara's table with some regularity, because Clara was transparent about her matchmaking and entirely unapologetic about it. He took her riding on 2 Saturday afternoons, out into the open prairie where the grass was tall and the sky was everything, and she found that he knew the land the way she was learning to know it, with a deep, quiet pleasure. On the 2nd Saturday ride, in the middle of August, they stopped at a creek that ran through a stand of cottonwood trees and let the horses drink while they sat on the bank in the dappled light. The cottonwood leaves moved overhead in a sound like water itself, and the creek was low and brown and perfectly steady, and Emma was watching a red-winged blackbird on a branch opposite when Patrick said, "Tell me about Philadelphia." She told him. She told him about the house on Walnut Street where she had grown up, and the parlor with the piano, and the way the city smelled in the spring when everything was wet and green. And she told him about her father, who had been a reserved and loving man, and about Daniel, who had always been her stepbrother in the truest sense, not unpleasant, but belonging to a different world than she did within that house. She told him about December, sitting in the parlor listening to the solicitor and answering the advertisement and the 6 months of letters back and forth with Gerald Whitmore and packing her trunk and getting on the train. When she was finished, she said, "Your turn." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. "I grew up in Virginia," he said. "My father had a farm." He paused. "After the war, the farm was not what it had been. I was 17 at the end of it. I went west because there was nothing left in Virginia that needed me." He was quiet again. "I have been a lawman for 8 years. I came to Caldwell 3 years ago. I think I am supposed to be here. Do you have family?" She asked. "A sister in Missouri," he said. "She has children. We write when we can." He glanced at her. "You, Daniel," she said, "and a friend in Philadelphia, that is all." She paused. "It was enough until it was not." "It is enough now," he said quietly, meaning something more than what he said. She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and the cottonwood leaves moved overhead in that watery sound, and the horses were still drinking from the low brown creek, and she leaned forward the 6 inches that the space between them required and kissed him, because she had been the one to leave the ranch, and she had been the one to take the school position, and she saw no reason why she should not also be the one to do this. He was very still for 1/2 second, and then he kissed her back, with the particular quality of a man who does not do things by halves, and the blackbird left the branch opposite in a flash of red and black, and the cottonwood leaves went on moving, and the creek went on running, and Emma Langley, who had stepped off a train into the wrong arms with the right man 2 feet behind her, understood exactly where she was. They rode back to Caldwell in the long golden light of the late afternoon, and everything was the same and everything was entirely different, and she was smiling at the road ahead, and he was riding beside her with his hat pushed back on his head, and the expression of a man who has stopped trying to hide that he is happy. Clara was on the porch when they arrived, shelling peas with the bowl in her lap, and she looked at the two of them for approximately 1 second and then went back to shelling peas with an expression of absolute serenity that told Emma she was going to have very strong opinions about this later in the evening. She did. They were all good ones. September came in on a hot breath and then softened into something more bearable, and Emma's school opened on the 8th with 14 students ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, a mix of town children and ranch children who came in on horseback or by wagon, bringing their lunch pails and their various states of enthusiasm or lack of it. She stood at the front of that classroom on the first morning and looked at the rows of faces, serious and curious and slightly suspicious in the way of children assessing a new authority, and she felt the particular gravity of it, the responsibility and the privilege together. She was good at it. She had known she would be, in the way you know things about yourself when you stop letting other people tell you what you are suited for. The children, even the resistant ones, responded to her combination of genuine interest in them as individuals and absolute refusal to accept nonsense, and within 2 weeks she had established both the warmth and the structure that a classroom requires. Patrick came by the school at noon sometimes, on his way past, and she would look up from whatever she was doing and find him at the window and feel the same thing she always felt, a settling and a quickening at once, which seemed contradictory and was also completely accurate. He took her to the harvest social at the end of September, which was held in the large barn at the edge of town that was used for such purposes, with lanterns hung from the rafters and fiddle music, and the smell of autumn and hay, and the particular collective warmth of a community gathered for pleasure. He had put on his good shirt, and his hat was brushed, and she had put on her best blue dress, the one from Philadelphia that was a little too fine for Caldwell on an ordinary day, but was exactly right for a harvest social, and Clara told her she looked beautiful, which she received with more feeling than she usually permitted herself to show. They danced, which she had not expected, because she had not taken Patrick Ashford for a dancing man, but he danced with a quiet confidence and a natural sense of timing that said he had done it before, and she liked dancing with him particularly, and when the slower songs came and his hand settled at her waist with entirely appropriate propriety, she leaned slightly into him and they moved through the music in the warm lantern light, and she thought that she had been right about something being right, which was the most complete thought she could manage at the time. Howard Creel was at the social, which she had been aware was possible and had prepared herself for. He was with a group of Whitmore's hands and he drank steadily through the evening, and she was careful not to put herself in a corner of the room alone. Late in the evening, near 10 o'clock, he made his way toward her when Patrick was across the room in conversation, and she squared herself and did not back up. "Miss Langley," he said, and his voice had the roughened quality of an evening's drinking, "you have made a good deal of trouble for Gerald." "I made a clear decision that was within my right to make," she said calmly. "Gerald had to write off for another woman," he said. "He is not pleased." "I am sorry for the inconvenience," she said, and she meant it sincerely because Gerald Whitmore was not a bad man and she genuinely wished him well with someone more suitable. I hope he finds a good match. Howard looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him seemed to deflate slightly and he shook his head. You were never going to be biddable enough for him, he said, which might have been an insult and was somehow not quite. No, she said, I was not. Patrick appeared at her shoulder then, naturally and without drama, and Howard drifted back toward his group, and the fiddle started up again and Patrick offered his hand and she took it. Are you all right? He asked as they began to dance. I am perfectly well, she said. You handled that better than I would have, he said. You would have put your hand on your badge, she said. I was considering it, he admitted. She laughed and he smiled, the full smile she had been collecting since August, and the lantern swung above them in the draft from the open barn doors and the music went on and she thought about how much she wanted this, all of it, this specific life in this specific place with this specific man. October was cool and clear, and she and Patrick took walks in the evenings after supper when the air was clean and cold, and the sky was full of stars. The prairie at night was a different thing entirely from the prairie in the day, immense and dark and sprinkled all over with light, and on one of those walks he stopped at the edge of town where the buildings ended and the grass began and he told her that he loved her. He did not make a theatrical event of it. He said it the way he said most things, directly and without a great deal of decoration, looking at her in the dark with the stars behind him. I have been in love with you since the platform, he said. I would not say so before because you had enough to manage without me adding to it, but I am saying it now. She stood very still for a moment. Since the platform, she said. You came down those steps and walked straight into Howard Creel's arms and I was standing 2 feet behind you thinking, that is the wrong man, and I could not have explained why I was so certain about it. He paused, but I was. You were right, she said. She took his hand, both of them looking out over the dark prairie. I have loved you since the creek, she said, though if I am honest it started before that. He brought her hand up and pressed it against the side of his face for a moment in a gesture so simply tender that she felt it in her whole body. And then he kissed her properly, in the starlight at the edge of Caldwell, with the grass moving in the dark around them. She said yes when he asked her, a week later on the front porch of Clara's house after supper. He went down on one knee on that front porch with the late October air cold and clear, and the lamp glowing in the window behind them, and he held her hand in both of his and asked her to be his wife. He told her he could offer her a good house and a steady income, and a life in Caldwell where she had already proven herself, and that beyond the practical things he could offer her, he would love her and respect her and be with her fully for as long as he had breath. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Clara came out of the house 2 minutes later because she had been watching through the window, which neither of them had doubted, and she clasped both of their hands and was very composed for about 4 seconds and then was not composed at all, and it was one of the best evenings Emma could remember. They were married in November, on a Saturday, at the Methodist Church on 2nd Street. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Calloway, who had a great deal of enthusiasm for the institution of matrimony, and a sermon that was both warm and mercifully brief. Clara stood with Emma and the deputy marshal, a young man named Cole Riggins who had a great deal of admiration for Patrick, and said everything at a slightly louder volume than necessary, stood with Patrick. The church was full, which surprised Emma, who had been in Caldwell for only 4 months, but Clara had introduced her to everyone, and the school had introduced her to every family in the district, and she had become, without fully realizing it, a part of the town's fabric. She walked up the aisle in her Philadelphia dress, the blue one, with late November light coming through the plain windows, and when she reached the front and looked at Patrick standing there with his hat in his hands and something entirely unguarded in his face, she understood that whatever she had thought she was coming west for when she answered that advertisement in December, it had led her here, and here was exactly right. They said their vows, which were simple and meant fully, and she put on a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a small gold band with a single twist that fit her finger perfectly. And the church applauded in the genuine, unsophisticated way of people who are actually happy for other people, and Cole Riggins was the loudest. The wedding supper was at Clara's house, which held more people than seemed physically possible, and there was food enough for twice the number who came, and there were toasts that were heartfelt and occasionally embarrassing, and the fiddle player from the Harvest Social came and played, and the evening was long and warm, and everything that a wedding evening is supposed to be. They moved into the house that Patrick had rented on Maple Street, the one he had been in for 2 years that was now theirs. 3 rooms and a kitchen and a proper wood stove, and a front porch with a view east toward the open prairie. Emma brought her trunk, which had been in Clara's spare room since July, and she unpacked it into the wardrobe in the bedroom, and set her hairbrush on the dresser beside his, and put her Bible on the windowsill, and stood in the middle of the room, and felt the rightness of it like a physical thing. Their first winter together was cold and clear and contained, a good fire in the evenings, and supper at the table, and the sounds of a town settling under snow outside the windows. She taught school through December and January, with the children wrapped in their coats, and the wood stove in the corner of the classroom working hard, and she graded papers by lamplight at the kitchen table, and he read or worked at his own papers across from her, and they talked about everything. The school, the town, the things each of them was thinking about, and she discovered that he was wry and observant and quietly funny, and had strong opinions about justice that he acted on whenever he could. She discovered something else that winter, in February, which she told him on a Tuesday evening when they were sitting by the fire. She told him carefully, watching his face, and the expression that moved across it was the most open she had seen him, a kind of awe and pleasure that he did not even try to contain. He crossed to her and knelt down by the chair and put both hands on her face with extraordinary gentleness and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Are you well? Are you happy?" "I am both," she said. "Good," he said. "That is the only thing that matters to me." He was attentive and practical about it in exactly the way she had known he would be, making sure she was eating well and not taking unnecessary rides in the cold, and leaving a space for her to manage her own experience without smothering it with anxiety. Clara was beside herself with joy and immediately began knitting. The spring of 1883 came in a rush, the prairie going from brown to green almost overnight, the cottonwood trees along the creek putting out their pale leaves, the sky softening from the hard blue of winter to something warmer. Emma's students presented a small exhibition at the end of the school year in May, performing the poems and passages they had learned through the winter, and she stood at the back of the room watching them with her hands clasped and Patrick standing beside her with his arm touching hers, and the families filled the room, and she thought about a December morning in a parlor in Philadelphia listening to a solicitor, and she thought about all the distance between that morning and this one. Their son was born in October of 1883, at the beginning of the month when the air was beginning to turn cool, and the leaves on the cottonwoods were going golden. Clara was there, and the local doctor, and the delivery was long and not easy, and Emma bore it with the same quality she brought to everything, a fierce and steady determination. And when it was over and the doctor put the child in her arms, she was exhausted to the marrow of her bones, and also more alive than she had ever felt. Patrick was allowed in after, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she held the baby toward him, and he took him with the careful, reverent precision of a man who has never held anything so important. And the baby, who was red and small and seemed to have strong opinions about everything already, settled in his arms with the absolute trust of newborns, and Patrick looked down at him with an expression Emma knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "He needs a name," she said. They had discussed this, they had a list. James, Patrick said, James Thomas Ashford, James for the brother Patrick had lost in Virginia, Thomas for her father. "Yes," she said, "that is his name." James Thomas Ashford was a robust and vocal child who from the beginning appeared to take his personal needs very seriously, and was deeply invested in making sure everyone around him understood this. He had Patrick's coloring and Emma's eyes, and a personality that was entirely his own, and he was the occasion for an ongoing renegotiation of sleep schedules that Emma and Patrick navigated with the combined determination of two people who had managed harder things and a great deal of humor. Clara was a devoted presence, coming by several mornings a week in the first months, and the school board was understanding about Emma taking the spring term of 1884 at home with the baby, with a substitute hired for that period, and she returned to her classroom in September of 1884 with James in the care of a young woman named Nellie, the eldest daughter of one of the town families, who was 16 and adored him. Life built itself in the way that good lives do, steadily and with texture, adding rooms and seasons and people. Emma and Patrick were at the center of a life in Caldwell that was real and rooted, full of the ordinary fabric of a community, the weekly rhythms of school and church and market, the particular pleasures of Saturday evenings when he was not called away on business, and they sat on the porch watching the night come in and talked about everything, and nothing in the easy, intimate shorthand of people who know each other deeply. Howard Creel left the Whitmore Ranch in the spring of 1883 and passed through Caldwell on his way somewhere else, and tipped his hat to Emma in the street with an expression of something that might have been, very distantly, respect. She nodded back. Gerald Whitmore did indeed marry again, a woman named Ruth from Iowa who by all accounts was extremely well organized and not in the least opinionated, and Clara reported with considerable satisfaction that by the time of the wedding Ruth had already reorganized the ranch accounts in a manner that Gerald had initially resisted and then acknowledged was superior. Emma was glad for him. She was genuinely glad. The years moved through their seasons with the reliable beauty of the Kansas prairie, each one distinct, the hard, bright winters and the explosive springs and the long, golden summers and the crisp, particular perfection of autumn. Emma's school grew as the town grew, and she took on a second teacher in 1886, a young woman just arrived from Ohio who was quiet and capable, and whom Emma mentored with the specific pleasure of someone passing forward what had been given to them. Patrick continued as town marshal through those years, managing the steady business of a cattle town that was growing and changing, enforcing the laws with the same even-handed quality she had seen in him from the beginning. He was well respected and she understood why, not because he was imposing, though he was that, but because he was fair, genuinely fair, and people knew it. There were hard things, as there are always hard things. In the spring of 1885, a sickness went through the town and took two of Emma's students, children she had taught for 2 years, and she grieved them with the full weight of it, and Patrick sat with her grief the way he sat with everything, steadily, and without trying to fix it or minimize it, just present. There was a period in 1886 when a group of cattle barons attempted to pressure the town council into removing Patrick from his position, because his enforcement of the law did not discriminate between large landowners and small homesteaders. And Emma stood up at the town council meeting and spoke with a clarity and a contained passion that surprised even herself. And the motion failed. And Patrick said afterward that he had stood outside the council room listening to her voice through the door, and had had to remind himself not to go in. The injustice of it was not lost on her. The way money and power still tried to arrange themselves at the top of things even out here, where the land was supposedly free for anyone willing to work it. She saw it in how the homesteading families struggled against the large cattle interests. She saw it in how the native peoples had been pushed from land that had been theirs for generations. And she taught her students to think about these things, not with the easy righteousness of someone who had never been without power, but with the more difficult honesty of someone who understood that being without options was a particular kind of suffering. She was 30 years old in 1886, and she had been in Caldwell 4 years, and it was entirely and completely home. She knew every street and most of the faces on them, and she knew the particular sound the wind made in the cottonwoods in June, and the way the light fell on the prairie in late October, golden and low and heartbreaking, and she knew the sound of Patrick's step on the front porch in the evening, and the specific quality of the silence in the house before James woke up in the morning. In March of 1887 she told him again, at the kitchen table after supper, watching his face in the lamplight. The expression was the same as before, that open, unhidden joy. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am entirely certain," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. Their second child was born in September of 1887, a girl this time, and she came into the world with considerably less fuss than James had, and with an air of having assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. They named her Clara Margaret Ashford, for the woman who had given Emma a room and a path and a great deal of good counsel in the summer of 1882, and Clara Heston was present at the naming, and wept without any attempt at composure, and then collected herself, and declared that Margaret was a perfectly good middle name, and she was honored. James, who was nearly 4 years old, regarded his sister with the cautious interest of a child who has been told an important thing is coming, and is not entirely sure what to make of it. He sat with Emma the afternoon after the birth, very carefully, with Clara Margaret in his arms under Emma's hands, and looked at the baby with great seriousness. "She is very small," he said. "You are very small too," Emma told him. "I do not remember that," he said, which seemed to him a reasonable objection. Patrick, watching from the doorway, had the expression Emma collected. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was a hard one of the hardest on record, with storms that came in from the north and lay across the plains for days at a time. They kept the fire going and the children warm, and Emma taught school on the days when the weather permitted and stayed home on the days when it did not, and Patrick patrolled a town that was hunkered down and careful, and they were warm and fed and together, and she understood that this, the warmth and the together, was the thing that mattered. On a Sunday in January, during one of the storms, they were sitting by the fire in the evening with James asleep in his room and little Clara asleep in the cradle, and Patrick had his arm around her on the settle and she had her head against his shoulder, and the wind was pressing at the windows and the fire was speaking steadily, and she said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When I was on the train coming out here," she said, "I had a version of my life all arranged. Gerald Whitmore's ranch, glass windows, managing the household accounts." She paused. "I was very clear-eyed about it. I told myself it was practical and sensible and that romance was for people who could afford it. And," he said, "and I had no idea," she said. "I had absolutely no idea what I was getting into in the best possible way." She turned her head to look at him. "You were standing 2 feet behind me on that platform and I almost walked right past you." He looked at her in the firelight with that expression. "You turned around," he said. "You made me," she said. "You turned around," he repeated, and he kissed her temple. "I just made sure I was worth looking at." She laughed and leaned back into him, and the fire went on speaking and the wind went on pressing at the windows, and outside the Kansas winter was doing everything a Kansas winter could do, and inside the house on Maple Street was warm and lit and full. Spring came again, as it always did, breaking the winter open and filling the world with green and noise. James Ashford, nearly 5 years old, discovered a passionate interest in horses that spring and appointed himself Tommy's shadow at the livery where Tommy now worked, having left the Whitmore ranch the previous year, and found a situation in town that suited him better. Clara Margaret Ashford, 7 months old and thoroughly opinionated, sat in the middle of whatever room she was in and regarded the world with calm authority. Emma planted a kitchen garden that spring, something she had wanted since moving into the Maple Street house and had not gotten around to, clearing a patch of ground on the south side of the house and turning it herself with the methodical satisfaction of a physical task, putting in tomatoes and beans, and the herbs she had learned to use from a woman at the church who grew them. She was in the garden on a May evening, her hands in the earth and the air warm and full of the smell of green things, when Patrick came through the gate and sat on the back step and watched her work with the quiet pleasure he brought to watching her do most things. "Cole is getting married," he said. Cole Riggins, his deputy, whose volume had not diminished over the years. "I know," she said. "Clara told me, to the Henderson girl." "The Henderson girl," he confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "He asked if I would stand with him." "Of course he did," she said. She patted the earth down around the tomato plant and looked up at him. "You are going to have to wear your good shirt again." "I was afraid of that," he said. She threw a small clod of earth at him, which he caught. She thought about the version of herself who had read an advertisement in a newspaper on a gray December morning 6 years ago, and made the most practical decision of her life, which had turned out to be the most important one too. And she thought about how different the life she had imagined from that parlor in Philadelphia looked from the life she was actually living. And she thought that the difference was entirely in the direction of better, and that this was not something she had done alone. She had done it with Clara Heston, who had given her a room and a path. She had done it with the teaching position and the school board and the town that had accepted her. She had done it with her own stubbornness and her own clear eyes. And she had done it with Patrick Ashford, who had been 2 feet behind her on a platform on a blazing July day, and who had been in some sense 2 feet behind her ever since, steady and present and entirely, unshakably himself. She washed her hands at the pump and went and sat beside him on the back step, and he put his arm around her and she leaned in and the evening settled around them, warm and full of the smell of her garden. "Patrick," she said. "Emma," he said. "I am very happy," she said. He pressed his mouth to her hair. "Good," he said. "I know." He held her a little tighter. "So am I." The spring evening deepened into dusk around them, the first stars appearing above the prairie, and from inside the house they could hear James talking to himself in the high, serious monologue of children not yet ready for sleep, and Clara Margaret making the small, emphatic sounds of a baby who had things to communicate. The garden was dark and smelled of good earth and growing things. The light was still faintly orange at the horizon. They sat there together on the step of their house on Maple Street in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1888, until the dark came fully, and they went inside to their children and their life, and the long good story of who they were to each other, which had begun on a train platform in a blaze of July heat, and had built itself, day by day and season by season and choice by choice, into something as real and as rooted as the land that stretched away from them in every direction, limitless and theirs.